Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from that jingle-jangle time of year here in the middle of the country, in the middle of Iowa, good old Des Moines on Iowa Catholic Radio. You might know me from the Catholic Morning Show here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, where do people know you from?
So I am academic dean down at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where right now it's kind of quiet, but in a week we'll be bustling again, so blessed to be plugging away down there.
When you're in academia, it's never quiet for long. It's just either school's in session or people are looking to get into school and to be in session there. What's always in session here is that we are grateful for Imogene Ingredients for underwriting our show. Thank you for making that possible. We've been at the Uncommon Good for 9.5 years, Iowa Catholic Radio for 20, and once again, Imogene Ingredients makes it possible for us to be here on the airwaves.
Yeah, in a place like Iowa, I think Imogene just seems like a natural underwriter, so I'm grateful for their support of the Uncommon Good and happy to praise their work whenever I get the chance.
Absolutely. So thank you, Iowa Catholic Radio, and for everybody who happens to listen to us on iowacatholicradio.com or through podcast in all the ways that it gets shared. But it is the holidays. I hope everybody is having a very happy Christmastide as they listen here on Christmas weekend. So what are we going to do? What do we have for the people? What are they going to unwrap here on the airwaves?
Well, this time frame, it's always kind of tough to land on just one topic because there's so much to discuss this time of year. This go-around, we were actually thinking of tackling annually. The Pope gives Christmas greetings to the Roman Curia. On the surface, that might not sound, super pertinent to us, but I think Pope Leo's greetings to the Curia this year hit some real theological highlights, so a lot for us to chew on.
Well, ho, 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 Merry Christmas from the Pope, and we'll comment on that here on The Uncommon Good right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting our show. Wonderful to represent you here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, what we have for the good old children, which are our listeners, their stockings stuffed with care here on the Christmas weekend, is we're going to go through and hear some comments that the Pope made. If you don't mind explaining that, and we'll get right to it.
Well, it's just kind of a small T tradition for the Holy Father to address the Roman Curia. So those priests, bishops, and cardinals in Rome who assist with the governance of the church. And every time Christmas rolls around, he sort of invites them into this conversation. I don't want to overplay this point, but one thing that commentators talked about with Pope Leo's address to the Curia this year, it was toned down a little bit from what we were used to. I think Pope Francis, with some of his prophetic sensibilities, he tended to use this address to really set forth like a pretty bold challenge to those who are gathered around him. And so his messages tended to take on sort of like, if your boss or supervisor is trying to really like get you motivated,
right.
He thought this is the time you do it. I think Leo, he gives some powerful words here, some things to chew on, but it maybe has a little bit different tone than what we were used to with Francis.
Well, I think one of the modes in which we do most of our Uncommon Good stuff, we have various episodes over the decade we've been doing it that sort of fall into certain categories. One of the most beloved, if not by other people, I know by you and me, Bud, is you like finding questions, throwing them to me, then seeing what I have in store, and we do that vice versa. So we're going to roll out one of those episodes for Christmas time, and it will be based exactly on you're talking about. You're gonna mine the depths of what the Holy Father was bringing up to the Curia and see what my bedraggled mind, all eggnog, not drinking eggnog, I meant it was more the consistency of eggnog. We'll see what it can come up with. So let's get to it.
Well, Leo, to his credit, he begins by gesturing towards Francis. It's not that long ago that we mourned Pope Francis's death.
Within the year. That seems so impossible. It seems absolutely the case.
Yeah, quite a while ago, but within 2025. And so he says, as kind of an orienting principle for the document, he wants to use an apostolic exhortation from Francis, Evangelii Gaudium. And that document has two main pillars, you could say, mission and communion. So those are sort of the organizing themes of the Pope's Christmas address. And here, Bo, I think my first sort of pitch to you of sorts, Leo writes, or he says, by her very nature, the church is outward-looking, turned toward the world. It is missionary in character, for we have received from Christ the gift of the Spirit in order to bring all people the good news of God's love. And so, I mean, sort of extrapolating from that, again, Pope Leo is addressing the curia, so he has in mind sort of like governance or administration. But in this paragraph, he really presses this point that the curia should prioritize a missionary church, an outward-looking church, over mere ordinary administration. I don't know, a couple questions like, A, how do you sort of just hear that in terms of the Pope's actual address to the curia? And then if you sort of pivot to our own experience of the church, like thinking about parish life and things like that, why do you think recent popes and other Christian leaders have sort of highlighted an inward-lookingness as like a particular temptation of this age?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things that add on to that. On one hand, in the history of the church was forced to look inside itself for a while, but not as recently as it should have been. And so there's a way in which I think both Pope Francis and Pope Leo, and I think going back, John Paul II and Benedict XVI in their own way, had been calling the church to look outward. This goes all the way back. Of course, the easy one to think of is the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council. But as we've talked about multiple times through this year, I realize that we've had multiple shows talking about the history of the church, but particularly the relatively recent history in terms of the whole church, but for the church as we live now, about 100, 150 years back. The loss of the papal states, the sort of growth of the nation states, and the captivity of the church, where people from Pope Pius IX through Leo XIII, and all the way into all the way up to, I'm trying to think, Pius XII, you really did have a church that was sort of locked inside of the Vatican confines. You had a church that really had to look inside itself and ask, what would it look like materially on the ground when the nation states, like the newly formed one like Italy, that had only recently begun to exist in the 1800s, how was it that the church was going to exist in relationship to that material, the material fact of the church-state relations on the ground? And so, on one hand, I want to say it wasn't the fault of the church that it had to do that for a while. It really did. And maybe that came with some pitfalls. Maybe that caused some difficulties and errors when it comes to this sort of missionary call. But I understand very much so why the church got in that mode. And but it's just fair to say it took a while for the church to really understand that that's something that we need to pivot from, which is to say, in all difficulties in history, Christ is always looking to make death into life, to figure out resurrection in the face of the grave. And so an old order, Bud, where the church had a state, right? And the Roman See was an international player as a state among many, went away, and with that, certain prerogatives, certain things it was able to do, fell by the wayside. And, Bud, sometimes it just takes a while to get out of those habits. I think when people can misunderstand, like what Leo XIV is saying, is that, this is what the everyone bad in the church simply looks inward. But that's obviously not the case, because Pope Leo XIV has talked about all the times that we need to have an inner life, actually, right? And that he's very Augustinian, and anybody who loves St. Augustine is not going to act like looking inside oneself is always bad. But it's certainly to say that what probably became a deep-seated habit in the church due to material and historical circumstance, that it's time to say whatever else happened in that regard, whatever it was lost, a new beginning was able to be had, Bud, which is to say we get a chance to be a missionary church in a way that hasn't been the case for many centuries. Yeah. We get to sort of recapitulate what that first apostolic fervor was like. In some ways, because we're both reaching parts of the globe that the church never did before within the last 100 years, and also that there's a way in which we really have to re-evangelize Europe and America and places that have been Catholic for a long time. It's right to say the stance is to be missional in a way that the church maybe had to be a church of the catacombs for a while. And so I think that that's the best sort of way to think about this in the long historical arc of the Catholic Church, And then the second one I would say is more directly tied to what we're dealing with now, like humans in 2025, which is to say it's easy to be distracted, it's easy to be fragmented, so it's easy to be, because of that dissociative nature, the fact that we don't have a strong sense of self, oftentimes we overdo looking inside of ourselves because we're just trying to hold it together, bud. It really does seem like that if we let go and look outside of ourselves, everything's just going to fall apart. And I think Leo XIV is telling us to have trust in God, that our identity, as it were, can be strong and firm in God, but we're going to only have that if we turn outwards for the sake of others.
Well, you've studied some church history in your time, Bo, and what do you think of this analysis of sort of how things have proceeded? Some church historians have called, like, from the mid-20th century to our own time, the age of the church. And what they mean by that in part is that theologians, in sort of a particularly emphatic way, have written a lot about the church, especially since the time of the council. And I don't want to talk my way out of a vocation here, because a lot of my own writing has been on ecclesiology, or like the structural study of the church, right? But in reading someone like St. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, or Duns Scotus, whichever one you want to mention, it almost feels like they take the church for granted, meaning,
yes,
because it's the water they swim in,
right?
They don't step back and do like kind of like detached or like third person like event, like they don't write about the church as kind of an object of study,
right?
And so that kind of discourse has birthed a sort of like heavy focus on what does it mean to be the church, and of course, like, the church is part and parcel of God's work. Like, this is the people He has redeemed. But maybe there's a way where you can start to talk about that so much that you forget sort of like the church's mission to the world.
Well, I think it's twofold. On one hand, the church only really talks heavily about something when it has become a problem.
Yeah.
Right? So when people go like, why did you not hear why didn't we have sort of the Trinitarian formulas for like almost 300 years of the church's existence? And you go, well, it became a problem 300 years into it, because before that, the big problem was don't die. And, also like, was Jesus divine or not? Right. And so now we have this new problem. Now we're going to talk about it. And in some ways, this can seem reactive, but I think this is just to say that the church, in its magisterium, is mostly talking about correcting errors so that we can rightly worship and follow what the Lord has asked of us. And so it makes sense that, like, into the 20th century, like you said, the very notion of what is the church, another one, Bud, in your wheelhouse, what is history, doesn't come into play in a way that the Middle Ages could assume. And I think what's being said here is the fact that we're maybe getting saturated by these questions is a good indication that there's new questions being asked that the church must turn itself to. One of them going back to its fundamental aspect of missionizing the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so when the church forgot how to be the church, many great people rose up at the behest of God to say, what is the church? And so maybe when we've lost that missional aspect, the question is to say, God's raising up people to say, what is the mission? And again, the other one I think is this happens quite a bit, where if you don't talk about something while you're swimming in it. We had the occasion to have the very question of the ecclesiology of the church, what it looked like, call into question in a way that even wasn't the case with the Reformation. And so now we're going back into an ebb and flow. So again, the Reformation pops up. We actually do get a lot of people talking about what it means to be Catholic, but then what happened, Bud? This great evangelical fervor. So maybe this is history not actually repeating itself, but echoing itself, where we had the occasion to really say, what does it mean to be the church in the modern world when that very reality is called into question? And so now it's time to start imitating those great counter-Reformation saints that took that sort of rumination and hit the ground running to go reconvert places that had fallen away from the church.
I know this next part of the address is going to be music to your ears, because you and I have worked alongside each other in various jobs and things. And the great thing about what Pope Leo says in his reflections is it's almost always very Christocentric. Mm. So when he's thinking about these things, he talks about like this exodus, this kind of journey that Christ made as the Son of God to save humanity. And he says even like the actual shape of Christ's life on earth, that's the criterion of like what we're called to be. But the part that's music to your ears, when he's talking to the Curia about like the structures that they're a part of, structures must not weigh down or slow the progress of the gospel or hinder the dynamism of evangelization. Instead, we must make them more mission-oriented. And the reason I say music to your ears is like we've been involved in some great apostolates here at Iowa Catholic Radio. Of course, at Mercy College, we've taught together. But modern, like contemporary society has a way, I mean, it tends to be very managerial by culture. And you get called into these great things. And of course, someone has to think about, keeping the lights on and keeping things running. But there's just this way that I think, really, frankly, like the devil enters into these things and sort of like we get like one of the great sort of temptations of leadership in today's world is being drawn into this like bureaucratic morass that sort of sucks the life out of you and also distracts you from what's really important.
Yeah, I think that sort of concern has struck in multiple times in my life. So I think you were right to think this would be music to my ears. Because on one hand, I just think in terms of philosophy, right? So philosophy can seem very ponderous because its job is to say, are we cleaving as close to reality with our words as possible? And words shift and change because that's just how human words have to work. But is the way that we're talking cleaving as close as possible to the reality? Is it adequate to the situation? But so that's very important. And philosophers are always going to come in as physicians of language, right? That's a Wittgenstein line. We get this from Stanley Hauerwas, who we've talked about. And theologians do this too, right? How are we going to cure ailments in conversation that lead to nowhere so we can try to get to the rough ground of reality as much as possible? However, bud, it's very easy to make a cottage industry and get a really sweet gig, at least in the past, maybe not now, in like academia or even in society, to be the sort of person that just endlessly decides that you can run a conversation to the ground by getting all nerdy about words. Okay. Well, the church does this as well. Human organizations do this as well. People will rightfully get sort of angry about there being regulations or rules like in organizations. And as I always point out to be, you can thank someone who broke the rule twice that there is a regulation. However, the sort of mean between two extremes, one is like absolute libertine lawlessness that actually doesn't work because we're fallen human beings and we need rules. But to your point, Bud, the other sort of extreme is to decide that the point of the organization is to make rules about the organization. And clearly, I think this is what Leo XIV is saying is we have to have structure, we have to have organization. Like you said, we have to have people thinking about keeping the lights on. But that should always be as light and agile as possible. And the minute that it becomes, there's so many things, Bud, that I say need to be considered for their own sake. But these are things that should be treated instrumental. And when you reverse those things, right, when you treat as instrumental the intrinsic things, and when you treat as intrinsic instrumental things, that's where the problems begin.
Yeah, and that's where I appreciate Pope Leo drawing us back to the example of Christ. In this way, the mission of Jesus on earth, which continues in the Holy Spirit through the church, becomes a criterion for discernment in our lives and our journey of faith and ecclesial practices, and also in the service we carry out, like he says in the Roman Curia. This time of year at Christmas time, it's especially important to go back to that fundamental criterion. And I know we've talked about this on the show before, but this notion of incarnational leadership.
Right.
And of course, for me, the one reflection on this that really can't be outdone is one of the earliest artifacts that we have from the first Christians. And that's this great hymn from Philippians 2, where St. Paul says, like, do not act out of selfishness or empty conceit, but consider others as greater than yourselves, and humility count others better than yourselves. Have the same mind in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he's in the form of God, did not consider equality with God to be something to be grasped, but humbled himself as a servant even to the point of death on a cross. And, it doesn't get much better than that, right?
Right, and I mean, I think that this gets into even the practicalities of the church. Regularly on the morning show, like every month, we have Adam Story come on and talk about canon law, and canon law is something very easily you can imagine getting into the morass and mud, right, of being for itself. But as Adam has so wonderfully put multiple times on the morning show, the law at the service of the church, the law at the service of the people, the law at the service of the mercy that God wants for his people can be exactly that idea, right? Is to put on the mind of Christ, to do these things for the sake of others. That does mean being reflexive and being willing to say, doing X, Y, and Z would be easy for me, or it would make sure that I would have work until the day I die, but I'm going to take that off and put on the mind of Christ instead, even if that seems like a bigger risk, or that I have to walk into the unknown because I've laid my burdens down at the feet of Christ, and I'm willing to take on what he wants for me.
Pope Leo doesn't get into this next point so much, but when I was reading that section of the address, I couldn't help but think about some of our episodes where we discuss practicalities of the common good, because when I think about being a kind of church that's not navel-gazing, but properly focused towards our mission in the world, as issues come up in the world, like one way we can get beyond this sort of like navel-gazing or not drawn into bureaucratic morass is by saying, what would it look like to provide incarnational witness in this context? And unfortunately, so often as issues emerge, what we fall back into is precisely that kind of like bureaucratic treatment of the topic. So to put sort of flesh on the bones, like imagine you somehow had an encounter with the Holy Family as they were fleeing for Egypt. Like there's a certain way, like if you think about conversations in our own day, where it's like, well, what should the Roman government, according to its laws, like how should it treat this family? When in reality, like you'd be greeted by the Son of God, right? And so, again, we're always kind of navigating a fine line here. Like certainly there are questions of like justice and the proper sort of laws that reflect God's justice. But on the other hand, like our starting point should be, how am I incarnational to the least of these, because in seeing them I encounter Christ?
No, I like how you put that, because look, the Roman Empire is such a great temptation because of its power and its usefulness and its ability to get things done. It built thousands of roads. It went all over the place. I mean, the idea of, the Romans as like simply the bad guys because they were like wearing the wrong insignias misses the point, right? That Rome was able to do what it did because it was a significant upgrade in a very, at least a utilitarian way, over what was happening all across the world. It wasn't by sheer accident. They weren't plucky underdogs. They really had a sort of administrative state for the ancient world that was not surpassed for many centuries. In the same way, we fall into bureaucratic stuff, bud, because of its power. It's done stuff for us on the ground that we would be silly to act like it never did. I mean, the quality of life for many humans in 2025 sits in the relative realm of decency, not for everyone. And certainly it crushes certain other people completely under. There's so many things it misses. I'm not an apologist, but it obviously has a power that makes it the temptation. And insofar as anything that we can quote-unquote say bureaucracy makes sure that we take care of people that would be otherwise overlooked, or that we can marshal resources in a fruitful way to make sure as many people have access to them, that's all great. The temptation is because it has power to do that, right? To organize goods in a way that is superior to basically anything humans have pulled off otherwise. The temptation is to ask it to do things it can't. So you can't be bureaucratic with the spiritual life. Mm-hmm. Again and again, what do we have is, the Lord pointing out parables where what you would think you would do doesn't work out in the spiritual life because of the very character of what the spiritual life is like. And so I like how you put this as we, in this segment before we get to the break, that if you imagine the exception you would need to make in any political order when you came upon the Holy Family, that if you had the chance to see Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, would you dethrone the operating principle that has made human life the best it could be until now, with something like bureaucracy, with the Roman Empire, with whatever you want to point out? Would you cast that crown at the feet of the incarnate Savior? That is a sort of spiritual practice and the true political practice that the church has to ask. Would we submit what we admit is the power of the bureaucratic state to follow after this incarnate babe, God willing to become like us And then that means us make similar sacrifices to Jesus Christ himself, being willing to become incarnate among us and share our life. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. Bud, we have been alley-ooping it. You take things you found very interesting about what Pope Leo XIV has just said to the Curia over his Christmas message, and then seeing what my addled mind thinks about it. So let's keep it rolling. What's the next one from the Pope?
Well, I mentioned earlier in that other segment that the orienting principle for this address was a document by Pope Francis, and the two pillars of that document were mission and communion. So in that last segment, we really hit on the mission part, and Pope Leo sort of like challenging us to be properly externally focused so that we have an eye on the mission of the church and remember that God has called us to serve others and to be out in the world, again, like in a proper understanding of that phrase. So the second piece, communion, this gets kind of interesting because on one level it seems like it could be at odds with what we just said in terms of Pope Leo gave this warning about being too inward focused. Communion certainly has to do with like the internal life of the church. But I think he's got some really interesting thought-provoking points here as well. So in this section, when he's talking about the spirit of the responsibility of the Curia, he says, at the same time in the life of the church, mission is closely linked to communion. So the two aren't bifurcated, they hang together. While the mystery of Christmas celebrates the mission of the Son of God among us, it also contemplates its purpose, namely that God has reconciled the world to himself through Christ, and in him made us his children. So Pope Leo there is getting to that point I made earlier in the other segment about how part of the work of God does is that he calls us into his family and redeems the people for himself. The Pope continues, Christ reminds us that Jesus came to reveal the true face of God the Father so that we might all become his children, and therefore brothers and sisters to one another. But he says there's particular temptations in this area of life as well, that we might fall into a kind of selfishness or basically anything that has to do with like the fracturing of communion. So this term communion, this was another term that was used a lot at the Second Vatican Council, that a good way to understand the church is that it's a life together in communion. And he says when we are called to that life, we can fall into the temptation of swinging between two opposite extremes. On the one hand, there's this extreme of uniformity that fails to value differences, or on the other hand, the exacerbation of differences in viewpoints instead of seeking communion. So the first one is, you could phrase this in another way as office dynamics. The Pope actually uses that phrase. But on the flip side, when you think about the fracturing of communion, the exacerbation of differences, he said there's the risk of falling into rigidity or ideology, specifically when it comes to areas like liturgy or morality.
You know, it's interesting in two ways. On one hand, he's calling communion as sort of like a mean between two extremes. So it's like a virtue. I mean, he's not calling it that, but there's a way in which it's analogous to this. Uniformity is too much. It's not too much unity. It's a flattened understanding of unity. And then exacerbation of differences, right, or maybe factionalism would be a way you could put this, is to think that uniformity, that unity is, as it were, it's too light of a touch, as it were, or it's not really bound together. It's like only like the loosest of federations. So communion is the mean between extreme uniformity and extreme fragmentation. And community is going to pull off two things at once, right? Like, so again, just as the incarnation, fully human, fully divine.
Yeah.
How are we fully uniform but fully distinct? That's the sort of weird, quote unquote, way in which theologically communion allows us to be truly ourselves, but truly unified together, not separating those two, not flattening unity into mere conformity, not exacerbating difference into atomism or complete fragmentary nature. And what this, like, I think this is where, again, him being Augustinian, whether he means to or not, it keeps coming up, because this is the nature of the good, right? The good is missional, bud, because the good can't help but being self-effusive. So the good, love, all of the best things that we can think of, they never are contained within themselves. They want to share. They want to be like a cup overflowing. All of that sort of imagery talking about God's love and his mercy in the Psalms is about the effusive nature of the good, that the good, insofar as it good, replicates the good and shares the good. And it's, as it were, the good cannot be contained in its goodness. It just keeps growing and growing. But in doing so, it brings that which it touches into communion with all other aspects of the good. So anything good in this life shares some characteristic with any other thing that's good. And that goodness itself, if it's anything, is that it unifies the good things in life in a way that makes it where they're not sort of just a loose federation of nice things that happen, but they sort of become a true interconnection. So that would be like communion. And so I think that that's what we have to think of as God, obviously, as the sort of prime example of what this looks like. God is 3 in 1. God is 3 persons, but one nature, right? And so whatever else we mean by communion, it is at least, it reflects the fact that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit do not, as it were, consume each other, but nor is it the fact that they're only a loose federation of 3 gods. One God, 3 persons. They are neither strict uniformity nor fragmented, exacerbated difference. They are communion, and we seek to do that ourselves. How do we have our distinctiveness? How are we, in truth, the individuals that we are, the true particular communities that we are, while being truly unified? And that's the goal, as it were, that is communion.
I think it's worth sitting with that first point a little bit longer. So I'm sure there are some listeners who hear that part of the Pope's address and think, how can uniformity be an issue? Isn't sort of like uniformity kind of another term that approximates to unity? And so if we think about areas of the church's life where you can kind of impose and undo uniformity, for me, it really gets to things like the liturgy. And sometimes as Roman Catholics, we're less aware of this, but the church is comprised of something like, do you remember the exact number, like 23 liturgical families?
Yeah, well, yes, the different, what's the
different rites in the church.
The different communions.
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Yes, sorry, keep going.
And so for Roman Catholics, for instance, to kind of like look down on the Byzantine rite because it's insufficiently Roman is sort of like a misunderstanding of the very communion of the church. I think another kind of helpful example is when we think about the different religious orders and their place in the church's life. And so actually my mind harkens to there's a time where we were at book club together, and the presenter was talking about labor from the perspective of Opus Dei and like St. Jose Maria Escriva. Had some great insights, but you sort of pushed back with the Benedictine perspective on these matters. And I think at the very least we can say, like, Benedictines bring something to the table that maybe Franciscans might overlook. Like there's this kind of like charism that's worth others considering. Now that's not to fall into a complete relativism, because I'm, say the Jesuits might be wrong about some things, and you could have a particular thinker who couldn't just say like, well, that's how we do it, like in our corner of the church. But there is like an appropriate like unity and diversity. I mean, you can get to this almost like at the level of fundamental theology. I think Balthazar did a reflection on sort of like how the church possesses a Marian charism, a Petrine charism, and a Pauline charism. Mm-hmm. And if you try to flatten that out and just to sort of like one manifestation of the church's life, you miss really important threads.
Well, and that keeps coming up in church history, right? So like you even think of something about like, you'll hear people go, oh, John the Baptist was replaced by Saint Joseph in church history, and that meant A, B, and C bad thing happened. Mm-hmm. Or you'll hear people go like, oh, we used to be a church of the 8 Beatitudes, and then they started converting barbarians, and now we became a church of the 10 Commandments. And again, all of these oversimplifications about what you're talking about as a true like diversity and unity and diversity that has to exist. And I think about the big arguments when the Mendicant orders started, Bud. Like, think about how it was a roiling discussion. What are we going to do with these Dominicans and Franciscans? And on one hand, the Benedictines were quote unquote wrong to act like everybody needed to be them, insofar as any did. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think it was right to say, well, the new Mendicant orders just can't willy-nilly, as it were, do whatever they want. So what is common to religious orders versus secular clergy, and what's distinct to Mendicant orders versus monks? And it took a while, but that sort of unity and diversity and unity, came through the wash, as it were. And this is because, of course, the dominant metaphor is the church is the body of Christ, and a body is not uniform. If, like, to repeat St. Paul, if it was all the head, all the heart, all the hands, you would not have a body or anything living. You would have a monstrosity that everyone should be scared of, right? And so it's the diversity of the body that allows there to be a unified living being. Mm-hmm. But it is not a diversity that's just willy-nilly, or like every, living creature of a certain set, like, well, this bird has 2 wings, this one has 25 wings. No, there's this sort of order, right, that they have. So the distinctness of the body, organized in a hierarchical way, not like in a stiff authoritarian one, right? But like, you can lose a finger, but you can't lose like the entire left lobe of your brain, things like this, right? Mm-hmm. But that diversity allows there to be a living, unified thing, and that's what the church does as well.
I like that, how you say it would be a monstrosity, and maybe this is an episode for another day, but it feels like a lot of times in science fiction or video games, I'm thinking of Metroid.
Yeah.
Nice. Like the final villain is a brain divorced from a body.
Yeah. Oh, man. Ninja Turtles have one of those. Yeah. There's a multitude. It's a great point. But yes, okay. So, yeah, take a note of that. We'll deal with the brains in science fiction problem. I like that. So
at one extreme, the Holy Father warns against a uniformity that fails to value differences. And for myself as a Catholic, when I speak of my own personal journey, that really resonates with me, because there's different nooks and crannies in the church throughout the world. And, for some folks, like, Baroque architecture really meets them where they are. For someone like myself, like, I feel at home sometimes, like, in a Benedictine chapel that's sparse, but still, organized with a kind of symmetry and like a beautiful simplicity to it. You think about that with like spirituality, the way that some people have like an intense Marian devotion to others, like there shouldn't be any Catholic who's like sidelining Our Lady, but these different kind of expressions of the faith. So I thought that was really helpful. But on the flip side of that, the Pope does warn against falling into rigidity or ideology, specifically when it comes to liturgy or morality. And of course, on the show, Bo, you and I have never shied away from challenging topics. I'm going to try to tackle one here. And what's funny is, like, I think in our friend circles, like, some people sometimes perceive you as like the more prophetic in character or like bolder. But I feel like when we've skirted challenging topics that maybe would cause us to lose listeners, it's usually my fault. But I do see this in the church today. Like, I don't know about the Roman Curia, but certainly like in communities like here in the United States where the trend of being based.
Yes.
Like there's, I think, especially young men who are drawn to like a conservative perspective, but it turns into sort of just like owning the libs. And this kind of, I think it's a reaction to feeling pushed or pressured to affirm things that they don't want to affirm.
Right.
And so it's not a totally uncalled for kind of defensive stance. But I see this especially, I think, in online, like in virtual spheres. And maybe that's unfair. When you're scrolling through Twitter or reading Facebook, you never know how representative a particular perspective is.
Right.
But I have seen a tendency in some circles to take the treasures of the church, whether that's liturgy, devotional life, culture, and to turn that into sort of a, I don't know how else to say it, to be like based, where, there are individuals now who feel sort of like threatened by certain forces or the need to kind of like button down the hatches. And embracing these things is not really like a following of Jesus, but it's kind of it's kind of a defensive posture and a sort of like, we're going to stick it to the people who are making our lives worse.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say, how many times have humans thought fighting fire with fire works, and it doesn't? And so if you've been worried about identity politics or identitarian sort of ways of social organization, fighting back with being identitarian about certain aspects of the church seems to miss the point greatly. And, it's like you said, but sometimes this gets hard to talk about because it sounds like what you're saying is either this stuff is not as important as you say, or it sounds like you're choosing sides, or that you're like trying to play all sides. But what I would argue is that it fundamentally misses why the treasures of the church are the treasures of the church, and I think it degrades them. So I'm actually trying to up the ante as well. When you treat things like the traditions of the church like footballs to kick around, when you choose it as like a T-shirt that you buy and you get to pretend now that you have a certain identity, when you use parts of the church or the church herself for utilitarian means, as an instrument, as a thing to use for some aspect you need it for, you have fundamentally failed. And what is funny is in trying to avoid modernism, you have now enacted the most modernist thing you can do, which is to use aspects of tradition as a hat to wear, as a wink or a nod to an in-group, whatever else that it is. If these treasures of the church are worth it for them, at all, they're worth it in and of themselves. And although all sacramental signs point to God himself, all things, even liturgical, right, point through themselves to the reality of God, they aren't to be seen as something that I use for my own ends. I submit myself to these signs, and by participation in them, in fact, in sort of kenosis, in emptying myself into the liturgical signs, the liturgical realities, the traditions of the church, I am now participating in the reality that they point through themselves towards, which is the life of the Holy Trinity. And that is not a plaything. That is not an accessory. That is not something to be used, as the Pope is saying, in sort of rigid, fragmentary platooning of different sides in debates. And, I'll steal this from a wonderful homily from Father P.J. McManus, where he was talking about the difference between decoration and ornamentation. And it's great because I've been using ornamentation a long time, like trying to get at something. But the way he put that the opposite is decoration really helped. You decorate things you want people to not look at. So decoration covers up something that otherwise you don't want to look at. Our table's messy because we have all these kids. We're going to put a nice tablecloth on it and put a setting on it for Thanksgiving. We're going to decorate. Ornamentation is precisely for the sake of showing and pointing to the thing that is most important. So a monstrance for the Blessed Host is not a decoration, it's ornamentation. It ornaments by calling, and I mean, in fact, I love the idea of a monstrance being sort of really important about how, Bud, we would prize these traditions of the church. A monstrance points to the fact that this humble bread is the host, which is the Eucharist. Right? That is the sort of amazing, contradictory thing that our senses see, that all of this gold is not for its own sake. It points to the humble bread, which our Lord has allowed himself to be. That's what we should be like. Any ornamentation that we have, and I, of all people, think that it's high time we care for the actual tradition of the church and bring them forward as the thing to hold out against the sort of sheer functionalism and utilitarianism of the world, but they should always be an ornament to the reality of the treasures and the truth of the church, and not a decoration for myself.
Yeah, and what's really beautiful about what the Holy Father does in that section of the address, as he kind of unpacks these things and presents an antidote, is as a good Augustinian, he turns to the writings of St. Augustine. This paragraph, I think, is worth quoting. So he's challenging the Curia to be builders of Christ's communion. And he says, this communion is built not so much through words and documents as through concrete gestures and attitudes that ought to appear in our daily lives, including our work, unquote. Again, I couldn't help but think of some sort of like work experiences where HR is like, we're going to solve this communion problem. And so get on this software platform.
Yeah.
Write these sentences each week and your manager will check in with you, et cetera, et cetera. He's like, look, there's no like document that's going to solve this problem. It's having a certain way of life. And then quotes St. Augustine's letter to Proba, where St. Augustine says, in all human affairs, nothing is truly cherished without a friend. But how seldom in life is such a person found whose spirit and conduct may be trusted with full confidence. That's from St. Augustine. And Bo, for me, when we think about that danger of like falling into ideology, that's part of the purifying process, right? Like we're called to be friends with the other members of the body of Christ. And I'm not saying that to kind of like romanticize life in the church, but like we're called to communion, and communion involves encounter. And sometimes that encounter is challenging, but by coming up against difference, we sometimes see like shortcomings of our own or ideas that even need to be purged or purified. And that happens in sort of like the furnace of the church.
Yeah, and I think, it's not to say that you shouldn't have close, deep, and very intimate relationships in the sort of charisms you find yourself in. It's not saying that, like, a Dominican, like, one day a week should talk to a Jesuit, and then a this, and then a that, or anything silly like that. It is to say that the church is an interwoven reality, and that, like, you often find yourself weirdly, Bud, in this sort of like amalgamation of multiple friendships, and that very sort of interweaving is what gives the church in your locale life, but gives you life, right? It precisely, you said, that purifying way by being interwoven with multiple people. By the way, real quick, if you want to know anything you should do over Christmas, read the letter to Proba by Augustine. Nice. It's one of the most it's I would start everyone on St. Augustine with the letter to Proba. So, of course, Leo XIV would know that that's the thing to quote. But I would say, like, finishing up here on this segment, that's something that we should really take to heart, is that communion is not something that gets solved. It's something that gets lived. And, to sort of make that one more comment on how we should treat the traditions and the treasures of the church, if anyone acts like they're a solution, they are once more being utilitarian about it. The treasures of the church are worth embodying and living, even if it made life harder. And so sometimes I feel like that when people, and I understand, you get amped up, you love something that you've discovered about the church, you go like, this is going to be the solution to all the problems. And what you really need to go is like, hey, if actually something like Eucharistic adoration, Bud, that has grown more and more through the past few decades, right? Maybe it causes more problems. Maybe it's harder to do. Maybe it takes time away from the priest doing something else. It's worth every problem because it's worth it on its own. So let's stop acting like the traditions of the church or the things we like about the church, whether that's high liturgy, whether that's being there for the poor, whether that's social justice, whether that is the beauty of its architecture. Stop acting like these are the things that solve problems, and instead say they are worth it for themselves. And the fact that we get to be in communion with the dead who brought these things about, that we now share in those reality, and that as missionally we get to pass the world itself into future generations. That is the true gift, and it's a gift worth considering here as we are in Christmastide. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. Bud, as always, broken record. Always happy to be able to do this show, but I really want to, here in the Christmas season, say it is a gift to get to do this show. And, Bud, we've been at it in a similar way for almost a decade, but I truly think going into the show and seeing where the Spirit leads has been a gift to me more often than not, and so I do appreciate that. Yeah, and I feel gifted by the gifts that our listeners give, most notably by actually tuning in and listening to the show or downloading the podcast. I don't know, Bo, I'm funny about all this. Sometimes I think, like, when I pass, my children will have the podcasted episode so they could hear Dad's voice. That is both beautiful and frightening. Somber. What's not frightening is you joining in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We structure it wonderfully, so if you're an early bird or an idol, you can always jump in. The rosary is prayed on air 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., 8:30 p.m. You can listen to the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:57 in the afternoon, or
jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
Folks, it is the end of the year, so please prayerfully consider giving to Iowa Catholic Radio. It is your prayers, it is your volunteer time that makes this possible, but it is indeed also your treasure, the ability to donate to Iowa Catholic Radio to make shows like The Uncommon Good, all of our local shows, all of the national feeds. You make it possible. Call 515-223-1150. Text 515-223-1150, or you can go to iowacatholicradio.com to safely and securely donate. Thank you for making all of this possible. As always, Bud, thanks. Merry Christmas. I hope you have a blessed Christmas tide.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, listeners, and blessing in this new year.
May the Prince of Peace reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we will be back next week.